Hi. So you mentioned a little bit to everybody how you got there because your daughter was reading a book. Um, is there any more to that story? And I think one of the things that I've been wanting to know is they told you to turn your camera off, and then what happened? And did you maintain any kind of a relationship with the Alabama Department of Corrections? What did they know about this project? Did they know? Do they know now? What have what have you heard from them?
Maybe just to start with the last part, they did not know anything about the film, and we worked on it for 7 years without them knowing anything about it. And it was only, as a matter of fact, when the film got into Sundance, they said, "Oh, we're going to announce all the 70 films," and we said, "Can you not announce this film until the last possible minute?" And they were very nice about it because they knew that the men in the film were at risk, and that if we were giving Alabama more of a heads up, that it could create problems. And we thought that the Department of Corrections would be less likely to retaliate against them once the film was well known. So we just felt like the more we could wait and build that awareness, it would be safer for them. And they sort of haven't responded even now. And they're, after the film played, we did a premiere in Montgomery. I don't think anybody's done any movie premiere in Montgomery for decades. Um, and I don't know, maybe Triumph of the Will or, something like that. Or, um, but they, but, there were a lot of good people in Alabama too, and they're not all of this mindset. And so hundreds of people came to the premiere. And then, like 10 days later, they had a meeting of the Prison Oversight Board, which is a completely toothless enterprise. And they just meet and have these little kabuki meetings with nobody showing up, and they don't invite public comment. And then this meeting on the 22nd, film came out on the 10th, the meeting on the 22nd, like 150 people showed up on the steps, went into the meeting. They had to move the meeting to a room that's like bigger than this room. And one of the legislators got up and said, we've been talking for 45 minutes. How come we're not mentioning the film? And like, I saw the film, and I think you guys all saw the film too. And everybody on the Prison Oversight Board had already seen the film, but they were just going to go through the whole meeting without it. And to answer the other question about what happened on that trip to Montgomery, when I met Chaplain Browder, who you see as the chaplain at the beginning of the film, he's really such an extraordinary person. When I met him, he was almost 80, and now he's 80 in his early 80s, I guess 84, something like that. And he's a very gentle guy and obviously man of God, and he speaks in a kind of a measured way. And he knew that I had an interest in this. And he was, I think, thinking, maybe this guy's going to come back, maybe he's not. He was telling me just enough to interest me. And then I said, well, if I come back and I volunteer and I come into the prison with you, what am I going to see? And in his very mild way, he said, I'll take you into the death row at Holman Prison, and you'll see it's a slave ship. Anyway, that moment, I think, just, stayed with me. And I went back to New York and got together with Charlotte, and just said, well, obviously we have to go see this, whatever this is. And then we went and sort of discovered what it was.
Um, Sorry, that was really there is something so urgent about the film. And it feels like a lot of that comes from the cell phone footage, um, which is just a remarkable feat of filmmaking to me. Just when you see a film, a documentary, where like the form and the content is so organically fused. Um, I was wondering how much of that footage you got, how you went through it all, and what did you expect to see, and did what did you have any idea what you were getting?
I mean, when we started speaking to the men after we left Eastern, people started calling us, and we didn't realize that there were contraband cell phones. That seemed like a crazy idea that people could call you from prison. But the system is so broken that they can't keep track of anything, right? There are no officers in the dorms. You have a 1,400 bed prison that's supposed to have 400 officers. Sometimes they operate it with 20 officers, which is one of the reasons why the brutality is so extreme. Because how do you manage that situation? And I think, um, you know, I want to answer your question more specifically. Tell me what you were just asking me. Sorry, I was a little
Were you,
distracted.
what,
Prior answer.
yeah. Um, what did,
What did we expect?
what did
we
you
were gonna see?
expect
Thank
when
you.
you saw all of that? Yeah.
And I think we expected that we would learn something about what was going on in this system, which is obviously a very secretive system. Um, but when we realized that they had been collecting all this material for, really for a long time before we got there, because they believe in this nonviolent action and they believe in the court of public opinion and being able to put this in front of people. They knew that nobody was coming to save them, and if they could get this information out. So when we started to see the footage that they had, even if it was just 30 seconds here and a minute here, it was so potent, and we had no idea how bad it was because we don't know. We drive down the highway, we see the little metal sign, and it says correctional facility, and we think like, if anything really bad was happening there, I'd probably hear about it. Some journalist would have told me about it. I can just drive on. So obviously we saw this material, and it was difficult to even find a level of material that was not going to be so distressing. I mean, it's very distressing, but there's a almost unlimited amount of material like this, and it's not just limited to Alabama, but that was the window we had.
Yeah, I mean, we collectively as a nation have decided to not want to look. It's insane that 25% of the general fund in Alabama is spent on prisons. And we're just sending human beings back out into society um, to go and deal with their trauma and the pain that has been inflicted on them in this, um, I call this the American Holocaust. There are people dying every day in Alabama, but all across the nation. One of the things I always say is that this isn't a film about Alabama, but it's actually happening here in California. It's happening in New York. As I said at the outset, I used to call home every weekend and share some of the horrors that I was experiencing. But yeah, when I saw the raw footage in Andrew's apartment on the Upper East Side, like about 5 years ago, I was immediately like just inspired and thankful that Andrew was taking this on. Because, like I said, a lot of us have been screaming out of our lungs about this crisis for a very long time.
Tell us how you came to start working with Andrew and Charlie.
Yeah, I met Andrew through my good friend and comrade, Benny Watterson, who's somewhere here. And there he is in the back. And we have been involved in doing this work. As soon as I came home in 2016 from serving 12 years in prison, I started to do criminal justice reform work. Started working at this organization called the Center for Community Alternatives. And my first job was focused on raising the age of criminal responsibility. At that time, New York was treating 16 and 17-year-olds as adults and giving them astronomical extreme sentences. So I started working on that. And I eventually became a program director at Galaxy Gives, where I met Andrew, and we have been supporting some of the same work. And yeah, Andrew called me into his apartment one day and showed me raw footage of the film, and I became involved. Eventually became a co.
I want to talk about the racial politics in the film. Stephen Davis, white, officer killed him, black. Was that surprising to you? Sort of other arms of the question are, what is the racial makeup of the general population, of the prison population? What is the racial makeup of the guards? I think it's at the end, you say there's like a 1,000 murders in Alabama. Like, do you have any sense of the breakdown of that racially? Just generally talk about that.
You want me to just do like a quick statistic or two? I think that the black population in Alabama is around 22 or 24% of the population. The prison population is 54%. But it is definitely across the board. And I remember talking to one of the wardens who was quite articulate and brilliant guy. And I said, how do you feel about the racial thing? And he said, oh, well, they're all N-word. And I said, what? And he goes, poor white guys, black guys, this all, that's the way people see them. They're all the poor ones, black ones, all one thing. And that is, statistically, I think that sort of an equal opportunity destroyer. There's no question that there are big racial disparities, including the fact that black prisoners are getting paroled, I think, at half the rate of white prisoners for the same actions and all that stuff. But those are the numbers for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, I think that there's notion that diversity is going to save us. That if we have more minorities working in the organization of the police department, that's a good thing. And this film shows that the point still holds. Right? This is the only place where you have a black man kill a white kid from a seemingly Trump-supported family with impunity. Nothing happens to him. Right? Nowhere else in the world. And had this been a black kid, Stephen Davis is a black, we wouldn't probably be having this conversation in this state. And we set out to find a white kid murdered by a black officer. It just happened. But actually, you show this film across the country, it shocks a lot of people, and to move some furniture in their van. They can't believe that this happened. But my own experience is that the black officers are as worse as, I mean, it, there is no difference really. In New York, the farther up north you get, the whiter it gets. Brutality is always the same. The officers in Sing Sing, which is 45 minutes away from New York City, they're as bad as the officers in Attica.
Also, just the general way that we dehumanize the prisoners in our facilities. I went on a visit to prisons in Berlin, and I was with a woman, this amazing woman who was the deputy head of corrections in North Carolina, Ginny. She was like in her 70s, and they wouldn't let her leave because she's so brilliant. And we went to Sachsenhausen, to the concentration camp, as like the first stop in our exploration of prisons in Germany, because they had to create a new constitution that was based on human decency. And we went to Sachsenhausen, and the woman that was giving us the tour said, well, this is where we bring people in the trains, and then we would, take off their clothes, and then you would, hose them down with like fire hoses, and then you put disinfectant powder on them, and then you would shave their heads, and you would take away any of their jewelry, and then you would give them a, number instead of a name. And Ginny leans over to me and says, we do every one of those things now in our prisons. And it's really like just strikes you that when you dehumanize the population, it makes less of a difference whether they're black or white. They look like just one thing. They look like they're people that don't have any distinguishing characteristics. They look like they're of a piece, and you probably feel less anxious about harming them.
Speaking of people acting without impunity, this was all shot before 2024, right? Just wondering, since Trump's second term here and the amount of violence that's being inflicted on Black and brown people, I'm wondering, is there, what's the situation like in the prison now? Like, has it gotten worse? Because
Well,
people can act with such you know,
Yeah, I mean, it's her friend Judy is here who ran the DOJ investigation and prosecution of this case against the Alabama state prison system, which is pretty unusual. They, the DOJ will look at individual prisons periodically, but looking at an entire state prison system as being unconstitutional is more, um, I think, extraordinary. Um, that was. Did you want to?
I mean, honestly, the Biden DOJ didn't do anything about this. And, the lawsuit that was filed, um, it had actually, the findings letter came out during Trump won. And to me, there is honestly, there's no difference. I mean, the DOJ has now been gutted, and there's obviously concerns that they're not gonna do anything, and this crisis is gonna continue. But this is actually a bipartisan crisis. I don't. It's tempting to sit here in California and point at Alabama and shake our heads. Well, just last year, Gavin Newsom vetoed SB 254, which would create more transparency and oversight in our prison systems here. And the excuse that he gave was that he didn't want to create prison celebrities, right? We should not be clutching our pearls to say that this DOJ is worse than Biden's DOJ. I mean, it is, but also we have failed across multiple administrations to stop this massacre that's happening in Alabama prisons.
But I think it's definitely relevant that I think the investigation was started under Eric Holder, so under Obama, and then Jeff Sessions had to decide when Judy and her group had done this kind of breathtaking set of two findings letters that describe the conditions in the prison. And you see one of the lines in the film where these four nurses were interviewed, and they said that they had observed guard standing over a man saying, "I am the reaper of death, now say my name." And this was happening. Judy team put together this exhaustive report, and the reaction from internally, they had to decide whether they were going to put it out or not. So obviously they worked really hard on it. They wanted to put it out. Jeff Sessions had to agree to put it out, and he did. And who knows how much, I don't know if there was any consternation about that, but certainly he did end up putting it out. And then when the DOJ team sat down with the lawyers from Alabama, and they said, well, normally the way this works is you guys try to make some moves to improve things, and then we would consider a consent decree or something like that. And they were like, yeah, this is all anecdotal, and you didn't give us a chance to review the findings letters before you send them out, and we just think you're wrong, so we're just going to fight you on it. And then they sued them under Jeff Sessions. So maybe that's the reason why we haven't seen this current, that the original lawsuit dismissed or abandoned under the current administration. I'm not sure they know what to do with it. And our hope is that the presence of the film makes it harder for them to say, like, yeah, it's anecdotal. We're not gonna do anything.
so tell us what kind of organizing around this is happening now. What is your campaign with the film? But before that, obviously, there's stuff that's happening. So tell us kind of what what people are doing to try to ameliorate the situation.
There's this whole impact campaign going on. There's actually screenings happening across the nation. You can imagine people in rural Alabama may not have HBO, so we want to make sure that this gets in as many living rooms as possible. The goal of the impact campaign is really to decrease the prison population in Alabama, make sure that the men are safe, and activate the nation. Um, we've heard from all over the nation that when people see this film in their respective jurisdictions, they're shocked. And we actually see change happening in other places first than in Alabama. We don't want to be like them. So, you know, that is happening. We're also putting together this organizing fund for groups in Alabama to receive grants to continue to put on pressure. And we'll see what happens in this next legislative session. But um, this impact campaign is going to be going on for years until one, we make the change that we want to see in Alabama. We bring the men home because I think we have more duty to not only protect them but to make sure that they come home, and to stay with them until we win.
I mean, I think a lot of times when you work on a film, you get very married to the subject, and then the filmmakers say like we should do something, and then you do whatever you can, right? Whatever you can fund, and it just happens that at this moment in time, and partly because of the organization that Billy and Alex are building, there is uh, older set of people who have been donors and participants in criminal justice reform who've been sort of at sea in the last year and are saying, what, does anything make a difference? And anything, we're just climbing up this massive hill. But it happens that group has gotten activated around the film and are saying like we're willing to throw down here for a period of time, and that means work in the legislature, it means political work, it means billboards around the state of Alabama, and it means getting this film screened, 100 times in Alabama, getting the incarcerated relatives of incarcerated people, because that's an enormous voting block that has been like sort of too ashamed to come out of the shadows. Because if you have somebody there's a lot of propaganda that says, oh, you've got a person in prison, but let's say there are 20,000 people in the state prison system. There are another maybe 25,000 in the jails, which are just as bad as the prisons. So now you have maybe almost 50,000 people. They've each got 3 or 4 relatives. 250,000 people in a state of 5 million people, where a relatively small number of people vote. Like, these people are starting to feel empowered, and we just have that experience we had of people stepping up and showing up at these meetings and stuff. Is I think that's the politicians that have a glass jaw, which is like they have to get voted into office. I mean, maybe that's not going to go on forever because maybe the election system is not going to work the way we expect. But at the moment, you got to actually run for election. You don't just get waved in by the president. So we're going to just keep putting pressure on and getting the politicians to realize they keep showing up at things, and the people sitting there.
We didn't talk about Stephen Davis's mother. Any short words about her? She was so amazing.
She's a remarkable human. I think there is no greater representation of someone throwing the ball up the hill when it keeps rolling down on you and trying to get justice for your son. Um, Sandy was with us when the film premiere at Sundance. She was there walking around with a oxygen tank. And, she's not doing too well right now, and our hearts are with her. But when Andrew and director Chaplain Kaufman knocked on her door, just to set the scene, they went to Uniontown, Alabama, population 400. Stephen Davis just had gotten murdered, and they knocked at the door. She had the presence of mind to say, "Come in and record. Teach me how to actually record," because they're fucking lines. And there's no hotels in Uniontown, and she told Charlotte, "You can sleep in the beach." Like, who does that? She's just an incredible human.
And when she went to that meeting of the governor, faced with the findings letters, had to sort of do something, so she created a study group, which is extremely productive. That was the group that you see where that chairman of the group is a guy named Champ Lyons, who is the former Chief Justice of the Alabama State Supreme Court, and he's the one who says, the only way to really deal with the issue of crime would be execution of all those convicted of crime. But we have this what is it called, Constitution, and a few other things. And so he, and by the way, the first thing he said at the first one of those study groups was not, hey, I just read these findings letters. The governor's asked us to study this problem. We obviously have a real problem, but whatever the next steps would be. The first thing he says is, we are under attack from the federal government. That was like his first move, Anyway, they have this study group meeting, and Sandy's in the audience with another 300 people, and he's up there basically saying, there's no public comment. We don't want to hear from you guys. And she takes her oxygen tube off. She stands up with that picture, and she walks all the way up to the dais where all these tough guys are, and she holds the picture up. And I've never seen anything like that. I mean, she's incredible. And this does bring out the best. I mean, you look at Melvin Ray and Kinetic Justice. I mean, these guys they're the most unlikely heroes, and they're so brilliant. And I feel so lucky to be on the phone with them or be able to talk to them. And they're such a huge part of our education and how the film came together.
Do we have time for any questions? Yeah.
I think regarding the death of Stephen Davis, there are 2 points that are important: that homophobia was involved, and that he was killed either because he is gay or because he's perceived as gay. And second, that he was in jail.
I'll repeat. You're saying the first thing is that it's important to note that there was some homophobia, or Stephen was killed either because he was perceived as gay, or it had something to do with it.
That the situation came about because of that. And then secondarily, that he was in jail probably because of that he was accused of felony murder. He wasn't the murderer, but he was charged with murder because he was
in the car
involved. Yeah.
Yep.
And it was very interesting that this should come up because just yesterday on John Oliver's last week tonight, his whole thing was about felony murder, and how this one guy was in jail for 30 years because his roommate asked to borrow the keys, and so he used the keys for his car, and a murder was involved, and this guy went to jail for allowing his roommate to use the keys to his car.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. There's so many themes in this film that one could pull out, but homophobia is certainly one of them. You saw in the film that Alabama has the #1 murder rate, #1 overdose rate, #1 suicide rate, but it actually has one of the highest rates of sexual assault as well. Just a couple of months ago, I spoke to this guy, 43 years old, who came home. He had just been home a few weeks, and he was brutally raped at Downs Prison. And when he reported it, he was thrown in solitary confinement, which is another issue that the film raises. And 11 days later, taken out of solitary confinement and thrown back in the cell block with the guy who raped him. Right? And that's not even the worst. He comes home and finds out that he contracted AIDS from that. They didn't even give him medical care. So that's the kind of just horrific things that are happening in the state of Alabama.
Hi, I'm a Salvadoran filmmaker. And I was talking to somebody about the prisons here, and 75% of people in prison had certain percent of dyslexia and ADHD at an early age. That's one thing. But also, I come from El Salvador, and the children that now are in gangs that are in Secot were survivors of the war that started from invasion through US and Russia money. So one thing that I think is missing is to follow or track white collars criminals that are financing all these, because eventually the correctional system is going to fail. There is more retirement police officers or correctional people or DOJ than people that are active. and that is gonna fail eventually. But you will see it, and it's gonna transform to probably mega prisons for maybe another 100 years, and then eventually it's gonna be psychiatric hospitals. But the slavery is gonna continue in different ways. But the important thing is to track who is financing the system in all the ways possible, because then we will find who are the really white collar criminals that are financing the destruction of education and the destruction of population.
Glad you mentioned Secot because I was just talking to a partner of ours, this organization called Glasswing International, and I wanted to partner with them to have a screening in El Salvador because
Oh,
the
I'll get you
El
there.
Salvadorian prisons is in the public imagination, and as a matter of fact, an Alabama senator said that he was drawing inspiration from what he was seeing in Secot, and maybe we should be sending our prisoners to Alabama. Maybe that's a good idea. So, yeah.
He actually, the legislator who said that, like almost everybody in the film, I'm sure doesn't visit the prisons, right? I don't think Steve Marshall. I asked Steve Marshall, the Attorney General, if he visited the prisons, and he said, "Oh yeah, well of course, yeah." But I mean, there's no evidence that he does visit the prisons. If he did visit the prisons, he's getting a very curated, short visit because he's a very important guy and he's got to move on to some other, political fundraiser. But he doesn't have time to visit the prisons, I don't think. But one of the legislators who doesn't visit the prisons said when he saw the images of the El Salvadorian prison, he was inspired because he realized that we could make the prisons in Alabama worse and it would reduce crime. And I agree, like the
The,
underlying.
if I can, what happened is El Salvador was really violent, and the fact of putting a lot of, like I say, kids that were war survivors turn gangsters, making the job of white collar criminals. They are in jail now, and it did make the population safe. It's true, but the the impact of hurting children, that's the effect.
Before we go, I just want to say two things. One is there's a little reception, and I'm happy. Alex and I are happy to talk about this film endlessly, so we're more than happy to have more conversation about it. And also, I hope that you will go to the alabamasolution.com because it's not just like a promotional website for a film. It has the data on, because we investigated all up to now, there are 1,382 deaths in the system, and we investigated all those deaths, and they're all described, and there's a lot of